First of all, a thank you for organising this event today to the European Movement Merseyside. I think it is incredibly important that we have opportunities to talk about the direction we're heading in and what the pitfalls are, and if there are any advantages, not that I'm aware of them, but what they are as well. I just want to make I've been asked specifically to talk about Commonwealth trade, which I will do in a moment. But I just want to make two general points before I get into that. The first one is that I don't know if there are any psychologists in the room, but they have a concept called cognitive dissonance. Everyone's heard of cognitive dissonance? And basically what it means is, and this is why it's relevant for this whole debate, that any inconvenient truths, you put them in a basket and call them Project Fear. And that's the world we're currently living in. Anything that comes up, we've heard some amazing statistics about regional disparities and all of the rest of it. And, it's either Project Fear or, since he's been invoked already today, Michael Gove saying, nobody any longer believes experts. Well, I actually spoke to him in a corridor in the House of Commons a few weeks ago and said, so where do you go when you're feeling ill, Michael? To which he replied, no, I was misquoted. But it is important that, of course, there's debate, there's peer review and all of that goes on in the academic world, but that we do listen to people who actually know what they're talking about. The second point I want to make very briefly, which Alison made earlier, is about where we're going in terms of the parliamentary progress on all of this. And like Alison, I don't really know the answer. But what I do know is that there is a growing enthusiasm for the Kyle Wilson amendment. And just for those who, I know Alison did mention it, but just to remind people, what it is effectively that says is that we have a further referendum, and it will either be the Prime Minister's deal or whatever variation she gets on it over the coming days, as against Remain. And I think that is the best objective we can come to, because there isn't at the moment a majority in the House of Commons for a second referendum. Whether you can get it by juxtaposing those two things, I don't know, but it's certainly something I'm wholeheartedly supporting. So, trade. So normally if you start, we've had Abraham Lincoln, I'm sure there's been other people quoted during the day. I usually sort of look at Oscar Wilde, it's usually good for a quote, Samuel Johnson, or Mark Twain, but actually the best quote, and it's not, a lot of people have used it in this context, is from Winston Churchill in 1948, even before my time, to the Conservative Party conference, and I'll read it in full. It's not a long quote. He talks about the three majestic circles, and he says, the first circle for us is naturally the British Commonwealth and Empire. Emphasis on the word empire, with all that comprises. Then there is also the English-speaking world, in which we, Canada, and other British dominions of the United States play so important a role. And finally, there is United Europe, and that is the context of post-war Britain. The truth is, the world has moved on significantly since then. And yet there are some people who are still arguing that we can rebuild our relationship with the Commonwealth. We can rebuild almost like some kind of trade empire. And, it is simply not feasible. And let's just look at the different options that Churchill talked about, which, by the way, were realistic options to talk about at that time. You could question the veneration of the empire, and I certainly would, but nevertheless that was the way the world was. So let's take the United States and Canada. We've seen statistics on that already. But both of those are so much more complicated places in terms of trade, in terms of relationships, in terms of who they're connected to, than anything that Churchill could ever have imagined in 1948. And then, of course, there's the relationship with the English-speaking world, or Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Very different. If you go to, I have a connection with Vietnam, for example. If you talk to Vietnam, or if you go to Australia, or if you go to New Zealand, or any one part of that world, the trade relationships that are built up there over the intervening period bear no resemblance to the old relationship we had up until maybe around about 1970, where there was agricultural imports. We, in return, exported implements and machinery and expertise. It simply doesn't work like that anymore. And Australia and New Zealand in particular, are increasingly connected to the Far East, to China, and to other parts of Asia. Similarly with Canada, connected, as I've already said, to the United States, but increasingly also with South America. And then, of course, there's the United States itself. Well, I won't go into a long discourse on President Trump. But I just would simply say the idea that we're going to strike up some wonderful trade deal with the United States that will see us out of all of the problems we've got is simply fanciful. And I'll tell you where that ends up, and there was a statement issued by the Americans today. Where it ends up is chlorinated chickens on our supermarket shelves. That's the reality of a trade deal with the United States. And then, of course, there is our relationship with the European Union. I'm not going to pretend it's always been perfect. There have been problems, there have been frustrations, and when I was a Northern Ireland minister, I had to negotiate certain things with the European Union, and it is the most frustrating experience possible. But it's far better, in my opinion and my experience, than any of the other alternatives. It also, and this is a broader political rather than trade point, it amplifies our voice in the rest of the world. I mean, this idea that we're going to go back to being this plucky little island whereby we can wag our finger to the rest of the world and they must accept our value, it simply doesn't work like that. The world is far too complicated a place. There are too many different blocks, political, trade and otherwise, for that ever to be in the least bit realistic. So what is it about the Commonwealth? Well, first of all, I think let's take the Commonwealth in terms of how it describes itself. It describes itself as a voluntary association of independent and equal sovereign states. Its special strength lies in the combination of its diversity and shared inheritance. Its members are bound together by respect for all states and peoples, by shared values and principles, and by concern for the vulnerable. Those are laudable objectives, and I'm proud that we are a member. The United Kingdom is still a member of the Commonwealth. I'm proud of the institutions. I was one of those who was glad to be able to celebrate the fact that South Africa came back in because they'd abandoned apartheid. Those laudable objectives and shared values, however, don't amount to a trade relationship that no longer exists. And so I just simply do not believe that is possible. Or if it is possible, it's going to take generations and generations. And that's, one of the challenges that would happen if Brexit does go ahead. How do you rebuild all those relationships? But I just don't see it in any reasonable time soon. I just want to, on that question of, sort of comes back to cognitive dissonance, and having sensible conversations. And I just want to recount this story. Last summer in Prescott, in Knowsley, which is my constituency, in Prescott where I live, we have an annual music festival, and we have various events, and I happened to go to one in our parish church that was an evening of big band music. Not something I'm particularly a fan of, but I was there and I enjoyed it. And in the interval I was sitting with an elderly couple who I've known for years, and they're really nice people. They're stalwarts of the church. They help the Red Cross, and we've got some refugees in Knowsley. They help out with them. So they're not the stereotypical Brexiteer that some on the left have painted as being racist and xenophobic. They're not like that at all. But we had this conversation about, well, how's Brexit going, George? They said. And I said, well, not very well, really. I said, and I'm really fearful about the future in this area. And they said, well, why is that? And I said, well, have you heard what Jaguar Land Rover have been saying? No, they said. I said, have you heard the problems that Vauxhall have got? And I told them about a meeting I'd had with 10 companies in Knowsley who trade with Europe, where every one of them said we're looking for somewhere on mainland Europe to relocate to. And they said, no, it won't happen. And I said, well, why are these firms saying it's going to happen? What is it in it for them to say to us that this is going to happen? And they said, no, it won't happen. I said, well, have you got, let's just suppose, for the purposes of argument, that what they're saying is right. I know you've got children and grandchildren. What do you think it says about the future that's there for them? No, they said it won't happen. And they said, and anyway, we're on a pension. And I kind of thought, they're really nice people, but when you reduce it to that argument, I'm on a pension and it won't affect me in any way, it won't affect my children and grandchildren because it's not going to happen anyway. That is really the very definition of cognitive dissonance. Now, I just finally want to talk about some of the others. I mean, trade between the UK and other parts of the Commonwealth is concentrated around 7 different countries. Singapore, India by far the biggest, South Africa, Nigeria, Malaysia, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And the House of Commons Committee on Trade looked at the implications of that, the implications of, well, we can replace what happens with Europe with what happens with the Commonwealth. And in evidence to that, a person called Dr. Vickers, who's an expert on these relationships, and was brought in to give his view on it, he said, and I quote, in our trade review, we've looked at the UK's trade with the Commonwealth, and we find that it is around 10% of its world trade. But it is also the 5th lowest of all 53 countries. Yes, the UK has the 5th lowest share of intra-Commonwealth trade compared to the other 53. That is largely because the trade is focused on the European Union, the United States, and to some degree China. The largest import partner in the Commonwealth for the UK is India, which takes around 20% of its exports. So, and he concludes by saying, I guess it's not either or. And that is the reality of the belief that we can just simply rebuild those old trading relationships with the Commonwealth. I think I'm probably running out of time, so I'll conclude now. But I just want to say, if after the 29th of March we revert to World Trade Organisation rules, we will, as a country, be absolutely ruined for generations to come. And my job, the job of all politicians, is to stop that happening. And I'll do everything I can to stop that happening. But if we fail, it's the bleakest future ever imagined at any point in my lifetime. Thank you.